Cultural diversity has been a remarkable feature of the Indian subcontinent, particularly in India, where numerous languages, religions, and beliefs coexist within a limited geographical area. This element produces a politics of its own, one which is replete with historical context and sociopolitical ramifications. The construction of Indian modernity and its post colonial character has only complicated its cultural politique. In this episode, my co host Amit and I, Srijana Siri, attempt to address the politics of culture and modernity in India with Professor Gauri Viswanathan. Professor Gauri Viswanathan is the class of 1933 Professor of Humanities and the former director of the South Asia Institute at Columbia University. She has published multiple books, including Outside the Fold, Conversion, Modernity and Belief. Thank you so much, Professor Viswanathan, for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I really appreciate the efforts that you young people are making to keep intellectual discourse going. So kudos.
Amit?
So, Professor, our first question is that we know that you grew up in India and then you went on to study and idea of India and Indian culture and Indian identity. And what kind of changes did that undergo when you undertook archival research? And yeah, just.
Well, first, just to clarify, I did grow up not just in India, but different parts of the world, because my father was posted in different places. So I did have international exposure from a very early age. So, but that aside, I think the question that you're asking about, what kinds of, how that affected the way that I viewed research, doing research and thinking about India. I think there has always been the sense of an in and out perspective that has dominated, how I view things, that, the sense of always being somehow outside of a kind of a closed circuit. Some people think about that as alienation, but I actually think of it as very productive in some ways, that you can see what you think is familiar from a very unfamiliar lens. And conversely, a place that is completely new can be also seen as a place that invites itself for discovery of a sort. So I've always appreciated that sense of being both inside and outside, but especially outside, because it gives that opportunity to re-examine, inherited notions. And I think it is from that sense of the inside-outside tension that I've been very fascinated throughout my academic life in investigating notions of orthodoxy and heterodoxy, of received notions as opposed to what is then deemed to be heretical notions. So this is something that has always fascinated me for a long time. And perhaps, to some extent, it is influenced by my having lived in different places and having experienced both India and the world outside India as at once unfamiliar, and that has been actually a very productive experience for me.
Yeah, Professor, as you said, that being in India itself is a really enriching experience, but the idea of modern India as a nation state is quite a recent one and a very modern one, if I might say. And in fact, I would also go on to say that any idea of a nation state itself is quite modern because it emerges from the Enlightenment and things like that. But how do we really understand modernity as a term, and how does it influence on society and culture?
Such a big question, and so broad that I think I would need to chisel it down to to give any kind of even mildly satisfactory answer. For one thing, this idea of the nation state as more recent than people might imagine, that is certainly true, and I think one thinks of the nation state as something that emerged from the wars, the civil wars of Europe over centuries, and the nationalism that these wars both created and also fostered. That there's always been an inherent tension between the idea of universal possibilities. Tagore talked about this stretch towards universalism. Gandhi also wanted to think beyond the borders of the nation and to think about universalism. Internationalism, which was such a credo of world thinkers in the early decades of the 20th century. And I mentioned Tagore, but there were also poets and philosophers. In Japan, there was a major figure, Kakuo Okakura, who was very, he talked about kind of working beyond the limitations of nation to Pan-Asianism in order to, resist the impact of colonialism. Because I think one of the difficulties about the nation state is that it becomes a concept that anti-colonialists were not really willing to give up either. The nation state became both what they were contesting in a way, but also what they preserved through through the formation of their own nations. And so some of the problems that we see in rampant nationalism, which even reaches a kind of rabid expression, one might be able to trace through this tension between universalism as a philosophical concept, which major thinkers of the 20th century really was trying to hold on to and espouse. And on the other hand, this kind of retreat into the safe spaces of the nation state. So, I mean, it's a big question that you've asked, and I'm kind of giving you this this response in terms of how I believe anti-colonialism was also captured by that rhetoric, even though it was contesting the very thing that it then later espoused.
So, coming back to talking about India specifically, we kind of live in a particularly troubling political time. Like ethics and morality are revealed globally almost every day. In fact, the promise of an egalitarian society with men's representation and justice has seen a greater fall after the pandemic. Notably, the release of the Bilkis Banu rapist is just confirming that. And like, how do you think our conception of the political, especially that of the gendered political, has changed in these past 10 years?
Well, you mentioned the pandemic, and I actually thought that the question that you were kind of moving towards was, how even within the last 2 years, this trend towards kind of political extremism, if I can use that term, if that has become accentuated rather than the reverse. And so I won't even go as far back as 10 years. I would actually say within the last 2 or 3 years, especially since the pandemic. And this is something that I've been noticing both at the macro level as well as the micro level, which is that there has been a tendency towards centralization of power. And the pandemic opened the door for that possibility, in the sense that, the rules and regulations that were set in, are not having the freedom anymore to be part of a public space and maintaining our distance, maintaining our social isolation, and all the rules that were associated with mask wearing and hand washing. I mean, there were a lot of issues involved with hygiene, which were, good. We needed some of those things to preserve our health. But I think one of the things that happened as a side effect of that was growing centralization of power. And I noticed this in the United States. And I think it's also true in India and true in other parts of the world, that the license that the pandemic afforded to nations to regulate the bodies of their citizens was not something they wanted to give up after the pandemic, unofficially ended. I don't know whether this is something you've also experienced, that there's always been this wish of the state to return to exerting its power over individuals. And I notice this is true in institutions, whether it's universities and schools, or whether it's at the level of government, that the tendency towards centralization that was accelerated by the pandemic is now something that I think we have to just sit up and recognize as a reality in our lives, and then work from there. Because I don't think it's just, kind of this long stretch of a decade or 2 decades. I think this has really been happening within the last 2 or 3 years, so that every time there's a crisis of sorts, the state can always take recourse to some legislation that came out during times of crisis, even though that legislation does not apply to the present one that is being faced. So this question of injustice that you're asking about, and the kind of appalling the acquittal of the rapists of Bilkis, and not just acquittal, but their celebration, on their release. I mean, these are some of the things that aggrieve us as members of a community, of any community. And I'm not talking about community in the sense of religious community. I mean community as people who are part of a social cohesion, social collectivity. And I often like to think about social collectivity as opposed to nation or group or tribe, or because we have to start thinking across these religious lines and across these ethnic lines and across these segregated lines, and because we can see what the consequences are when those lines are when those lines are observed in order to maintain power and control. So I personally fear that these instances of injustice are really going to accelerate because of just how much power has now been concentrated in the center. And I don't think it's just true in India. I think it's also true in the United States, and I think it's probably true in some parts of Europe.
Yeah, Professor, as you mentioned, I think the centralized power has sort of exacerbated a lot of tendencies. It's not just about one injustice or one instance of injustice, right? There's also a lot of religious extremism, as you pointed out in your answer. And the role of religion and nation and conversion is also something that you discuss in your book, Outside the Fold. When we contextualize these arguments within the present political climate, as you said, it can totally be said that religious extremism, nationalism, polarization has just increased, particularly in the past 2 to 3 years. But it's not the first time that it's happening. So how do we sort of locate these trends within intellectual history, and that how do we recognize that these kinds of fallacies are something that we have inhabited, and it's not something that has happened or emerged all of a sudden?
Right. These questions certainly have not emerged out of a vacuum. And this question of conversion, I mean, I'm so sad to see that conversion is still an issue that is very fraught in the Indian context. When I wrote my book Outside the Fold on conversion, modernity, and belief, um, I got into the study of conversion because, I initially, when I was writing Masters of Conquest, my first book, I was studying missionaries and missionary efforts in Indian education. So I got very fascinated by different missionary groups, their different responses to what they saw as their mission, their project in India. And even after I finished that book, the missionaries still continued to haunt me, to fascinate me. And then I got into this question about conversion. Why were individuals converting? Because, as you know too well, especially in today's India, conversion is viewed as a threat. It's viewed as a threat to the integrity of a social group or a religion. That conversion has the potential to upset the purity of religion. And I'm using the word that is often used by the critics of conversion, that individuals who choose to convert to another faith are, in a sense, undermining their own former religious system by converting. So that conversion has for a long time been viewed as a threat within Indian society. And so much so that when the Indian Constitution was written, there was a specific article, Article 25, which maintained a distinction between the profession of belief and the propagation of belief. That no individual can be barred from the right to belief, the right to profess a belief. But it's when that line is crossed to, that one forcibly causes someone to change their belief. So the Constitution was protecting the rights of individuals to believe what they chose to believe. And this was a very important provision. And I think a lot of the legislation that you see now popping up in different Indian states, whether it's Madhya Pradesh or Odisha, that there are all these different, there's legislation that keeps coming up which tries to curtail the ability of converts by, first of all, I think requiring converts that is would-be converts to register with a magistrate. And there are all kinds of legal issues that are now being introduced, all in the name of trying to prevent conversion. And in my book, I had argued, this is what fascinated me actually, when I started studying the life stories of converts and not thinking of them as masses, because that's been one of the great fallacies. And since you brought up the word fallacy, I think this has been one of the great fallacies of modern political discourse, that it's not individuals who are making decisions, it's masses, and that the masses are too ignorant to know what they want, that they're either being manipulated or ideologically bludgeoned, and therefore the state has to take responsibility for the ignorant masses. So this has been the rationale that's been used for introducing these anti-conversion legislations. So I looked up a lot of these legal cases. I actually studied some of the cases in the National Archives in Delhi, some of the archives in the British Museum in London, and some of these legal cases are actually quite extensive. You can find these whole cases. And what fascinated me so much was how these individuals were trying to make a claim in the name of belief that was constantly being ridiculed or sullied or made irrelevant. And it is from that reading that I came to view conversion as an act of cultural criticism, meaning to say that when converts converted, particularly converts who may have belonged to a quote unquote majority religion and then chose to convert to a quote unquote minority religion, that many times what they were doing was not just converting to another belief system, but they were also, in a sense, providing a critique of some of the failures of their original, religious system, or the one that they were born into. And that by critique, I don't mean, that they were simply attacking. That was not so much the case as that they were, in a sense, trying to urge a sense of openness and tolerance in their own religion. So this idea of introducing legislation to control what individuals believe in has been, I think, one of the most disturbing trends in Indian history over the last few decades. And I mean, I'm really sad that 20 years or more after I wrote my book, it's even worse now. The day-to-day harassment of converts, and they're being represented as traitors at worst, or fools at best. That they were just kind of fooled into converting.
So when thinking of conversions, as you mentioned, like people tend to think of people in terms of masses and not individuals. But then we talk about the individual, we talk about the individual and gender and everything else in like a very Anglophone. These concepts of the individual and gender emerge out of the Enlightenment era and like the philosophy that comes out of the Enlightenment era. And through colonialism, they have spread all over the world and has become a part of our cultural consciousness as well. And as a part of post-colonial discourse, what is your opinion? How should a post-colonial individual look like if there even exists one?
Well, I think that the premise of your question that that the individual can somehow be re-engineered in post-colonial times to shed the Enlightenment baggage. It's a great hope to think about if that can occur. But I seriously wonder if one can move away from that. And I don't think it's just about the Enlightenment. I'm thinking about how the notion of the individual is also very much contingent on ways of thinking about property and how one, ownership, and so that the idea of the sovereign individual is just very hard now to disengage the sovereign individual from the from that nexus of relationships that's engendered by capital and by property and ideas of ownership. And I bring this up because it's contemporary India, which has seen such radical transformation since the early 1990s. It's hard now to revert to an idea of the individual, such as Gandhi might have held, where the individual had an organic relationship with the social collective, and one lived in smaller communities, but one was organically related to others within that smaller community. And it's so hard to imagine now how that idea can really find any takers in contemporary India, where there's really that sense in which one becomes an individual by the very nature of kind of the neoliberal economy that has more or less defined the direction of the Indian state for the last several decades. So I don't just see it as a hangover from the Enlightenment ages and as something that post-colonial discourse can contest so easily. But I do think that it requires a different kind of mental revolution to truly discard the ideas of the sovereign that are of the sovereign individual as inherited from the Enlightenment. I think it's also the Enlightenment with a certain political economy, allied with a particular political economy that we're talking about. So the kinds of radical restructurings that are required to completely jettison the legacy of the Enlightenment, that is something that is really what post-colonial discourse could think about. But I'm not so sure that post-colonialism by itself, as a language, as a critical approach, has been able to do anything to that degree, which is to kind of work beyond the notion of the individual.
I think, Professor, I actually kind of echo your arguments there because I think me and Amit were just discussing this yesterday about how English is such a peculiar language. It's also colonial, yet so post colonial, because I am a native Kannadiga. I know how to read and write in Kannadiga, but I don't know how to read Kannada literature the same way I can English literature. I cannot analyze Kannada literature in the same way I can, say, analyze Paradise Lost and write papers on that. So, in that context, how do you look at English? Because right now, the medium of instruction here at Ashoka University, or say in any institution in India, private or government, still remains English. We're trying to escape English with the current political regime, if I might say. Modi also wants to bring in a lot of vernacular languages and everything, but it cannot quite occupy the kind of position English has in society. What are your thoughts about it?
Oh yeah, you're so right about that. That, and this is a real conundrum in today's society, whereas you know too well, both of you, that street names are being renamed, statues are taken down, names given, whether it's Rajpath turned into Kartavya Path or whatever, there's a kind of renaming process that is determined to eliminate the presence of the colonial era. And yet, as I was remarking yesterday, when I was just going around somewhere in a neighborhood close to me in Chennai, that, new apartment buildings are coming up almost every day. And they have names like Somerset House and Windsor Palace and 10 Downing Street. And I mean, I'm so amused by this because it's as if on the one hand, politically, we're trying to eliminate all the traces of colonialism. And yet when wealth is trying to assert itself in India, the way that it does so is by, reverting to these, kind of these majestic names I'm using majestic very deliberately, involving royalty, British royalty. And so where is that coming from? Why wouldn't people want to just name a new apartment complex on, something that is totally, why not use a Kannada name to name a housing complex? Why does it have to be Windsor Place, So I think that this is something that is very contradictory about India, and its real aspirations are reflected at that level. So much so that I often think that the other part becomes almost like a political, it becomes like a political sloganeering. that the renaming of streets, renaming of buildings, that we are on the, the vanguard of this new movement of free India. But I think that, free India is still clinging to these names, to signify its own capital, its own wealth, its own capital. So, and I don't see that going away very soon. I think that there's that the aspirations are still in one direction, which is why I brought up this point about the individual and how it is so difficult to separate the individual from political economy. And it is as if political economy is still driving the aspirations of people, so much so that the aspirations have an assimilation agenda more than a completely radical restructuring agenda, which is implied in your question, Amit. Yeah, so the question that you're asking about English is really, really interesting. That even after decades of independence from English rule, why is there still the premium on the English language and English literature? Though, frankly, I think that when I've worked with different groups of students from various universities in India, I have been struck by how much the curriculum has changed over the last few decades, and that there's more inclusion of Indian literatures in the English curriculum. In fact, I think in many ways the English curriculum has been displaced by the study of Indian literatures. Some of it, of course, is in translation, the study of Indian literature, but it's a trend that was certainly not there, 50, 60 years ago, when the curriculum of English studies in the Indian university was more or less a replica of the British university, which they took from India in the first place, So it's this very strange circular movement where India became the first site for the teaching of English literature, which then got exported to England, and then has been continually imported in India from England. But so it's a circular movement that seems to be, I think, not as profound as it was a few decades ago, and it's a good trend. It's an interesting trend. So what you are describing, though, is that it's not just about what people are studying. It's also now the standards, the approaches that they're using. That English literature may have a set of critical strategies that are not necessarily the ones that are used in the study of Kannada literature, right?
Yeah, and I think within that also comes the question of caste, right? Because when we are talking about Dalit literature, a lot of it is written in English. Yashika Datta's Coming Out as Dalit, which won the Sahitya Yuva Academy Puraskar in 2020, that was also a book that was conceptualized and written in English. So for the Dalits, English becomes a language of expression. But English itself is a casteless language. You're talking about caste in a casteless language. And I think that dichotomy is also something that's really, really interesting, because it speaks volumes about the culture that we sort of inhabit, how colonial Indian discourse has now become, and how we're also struggling to sort of as you said, go away from that coloniality and emerge as post-colonial individuals. I think we're not able to revoke or say invoke Fanon within us enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this it's such a great point to make about Dalit literature as kind of proving the lie to the kind of false dichotomy between English bad, English/bad, and Indian /good. And that the Dalit embrace of English, Kancha Ilya and other Dalit intellectuals have even celebrated Macaulay. That if for Dalits, English is not the language of oppression, that English is the language of expression, of self-expression. And of course, this is something that was so important to Ambedkar. When we were talking about conversion, I actually wanted to also say that Ambedkar, who was really almost like my model for thinking about conversion, that converting to Buddhism, he could look back at Hinduism as a system that needed to be changed, reformed to if Indians were ever to move out of the sense of tribalism that religions had become. And I think he had this famous sentence that I may not have had a choice in being born a Hindu, but I have a choice in dying as not a Hindu. And that, of course, is exactly what he did by converting to Buddhism and to find and to locate another ethical source for Dalit identity. And Ambedkar's search, he was, I'm convinced he is really one of the greatest thinkers that India has produced, because of the way that he was conceptualizing the future of Indian citizens who had the capabilities to move out of the stranglehold of caste, of kind of narrow ethnic thinking, of tribalism, and that even these binaries of us, them, English bad, Indian good, that this became really moot in light of the fact that for Dalits, English was not that language of oppression. It became, in fact, a mode of release for them. So I'm glad you brought this up, because I think this is really something that one has to start thinking about languages as not having a caste. That languages are in a sense, trying to transgress these borders. And if I can just squeeze in one other comment that I would like to make, one of the really remarkable memoirs that I had read was by a Dalit woman, Kumud Pade, and she had this piece called "My Story of My Sanskrit," and it's all about how even feeling the inequities of caste injustice, she happens to hear religious chants one day, and she's so mesmerized by the sound of Sanskrit, the sound, it's about the aesthetics. She's so mesmerized by the sound that she develops a keen interest in wanting to learn Sanskrit. And of course, everybody, tries to shut her down. Her teachers say, oh, you can't study Sanskrit. You are, you don't have the caste that allows you to study Sanskrit. And her own family said, don't study the language of the oppressor. But she was determined, because she was actually thinking about the language, the sound, the aesthetics of Sanskrit. So there was just something very remarkable about the way that her memoir brings to the fore exactly the point that you are making, which is that language by itself is casteless. It's the way in which caste is language is appropriated that imbues it with these caste identities. And in fact, the point of her memoir and her desire to learn Sanskrit was, in a sense, to detach Sanskrit's association with the Brahmins and to make Sanskrit available as a language to all people, regardless of class and caste. So that Sanskrit by itself has nothing inherently casteist about it, but it's the way that it has been appropriated and used by castes to deem all others, that there's no entry to Sanskrit for all others. And she defied that no entry ban by saying, no, I am going to learn Sanskrit. I'm going to make it my language. And I find it really remarkable, and really speaks to the point that you're making about language as not having a caste identity. Okay, all the best, and thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Thank you.